let's grab our Bibles tonight. Turn to 1 Kings chapter number 19, if you would, please. 1 Kings chapter number 19. I want to start reading here at the very beginning, verse number 1. There the Bible says, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and with all how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers." I want to bring a message tonight on the subject, battles that need to be fought. Darren Wilson became a police officer in Jennings, Missouri when he was only 23 years old. After a short amount of time on the job, he said in his own words that he had never seen so much poverty existing in such a small area. He served there for 2 years until that police force was shut down due to finances. From there, Darren Wilson was transferred to the police department in Ferguson, Missouri. And it was there that he was going to face the greatest test of his life up to that point. Officer Wilson heard that a store had just been robbed. As he approached the neighborhood, he saw 2 young black men walking down the middle of the street. He tried to stop them, and that's when Michael Brown ran toward his police cruiser, struck him on the side of the head, reached in and tried to grab his gun. In a matter of seconds, Darren Wilson had shot and killed a defiant young man who had attacked him, and the town of Ferguson, Missouri would never be the same. Riots broke out. The news media fanned the flames of racism. The race baiters like Al Sharpton came out of the woodwork to grab what notoriety and money that they could find. Darren Wilson was being demonized in every direction. He was portrayed as a white cop who felt that he had a license to kill blacks, and his case was taken to the grand jury. President Obama came out against him, as did Eric Holder, the Attorney General. The grand jury then came to the conclusion that he had acted properly. They refused to indict him. And then Darren Wilson did something that's easy to understand, but impossible to justify. He resigned. He quit his job. He tried to make excuses that he was doing it to keep peace in Ferguson and to keep more people from getting hurt. But the problem is that this was a battle that needed to be fought. When you're innocent, the last thing you need to be doing is running away. When you're the victim and you're being bullied, you need to swallow hard because you're going to be fighting the battle of your life, but then you need to stand your ground and see it through. Amen. When Elijah came out of nowhere and he appeared on the scene, his first job as God's prophet was to proclaim that it would not rain until God said so. When the rain stopped, the crops dried up. The grass died. The ground split wide open and animals began to die. People were forced to leave their homes. The price of food went through the roof. Thousands of people were forced to travel to other regions just to find food. And for these people, things had never been worse. They were hurting and suffering as never before. And a whole bunch of people blamed Elijah. It was during this same drought that Elijah challenged the prophets of Jezebel to a religious battle in Carmel. They had been dragging God's people further and further away from the Lord, and they had an enormous following among the Jews, so much so that Elijah, when looking over the landscape of his nation, felt as if he was the only one left. It seemed like everyone else had already embraced Baal worship. It felt like he was all alone. By the end of that day on Mount Carmel, God had answered the prayers of Elijah with fire from heaven. And the clouds were filled with potential rain because God had decided that it was now time to send it. Ahab immediately ran home to his wife Jezebel, told her all things that Elijah had done, how single-handedly he had slain all 800 of her false prophets. And then she swore that she would do everything in her power to kill Elijah. And it was after his great victory on Mount Carmel, it was after God had sent forth the rain. That's when Elijah made the same mistake that Darren Wilson made after the grand jury had refused to indict him and after he was cleared of all charges. After a tremendous, enormous victory, that's when he decided to quit. He had made up his mind to resign. He sent his servant away, headed out into the desert with no water, came to a lone juniper tree, and there he decided that his life was over. He wanted to die. He was through. In both of these instances, we find two good men who had come to the place where they viewed themselves as being done. Things in their life, they were not just difficult, they were viewed by these men as being out of control. People were not just upset, they were crying for blood. And the one thing that both stories reveal is a horrible battle that was not asked for, but it definitely needed to be fought. There are times in our lives when we get to pick and choose our battles. When given that chance, we need to do so wisely. We need to avoid battles that are needless. But we also need to make sure that we don't run when we ought to be standing our ground. And for that to take place, we're going to need some discernment. So how can we know which battles should be avoided and which ones require the best fight that we can give? First thing tonight is this: you need to fight and not run when your worst nightmare arrives. In Genesis chapter 39, there is the story of a young man sold into slavery. He had just arrived in the home of Potiphar. Joseph had been thrown into a well by his brothers, and then he was sold to a passing caravan who would sell him again to Potiphar. And by this time, Joseph must have wondered if it could possibly get any worse than it already was. Well, that's something that a young man wonders, because older men already know the answer.
Amen.
It can always get worse.
Amen.
Joseph had been given the run of the house. He was given great freedom in running the affairs of his new master as well as his entire household. And boy, I'll tell you, Potiphar felt like he was the luckiest man around, because he was pleased to no end this slave that he bought was extremely talented. This guy can run my finances. This guy can run my business. This guy can do it all, and I'm totally hands-off. And for some reason, boy, everything that this guy touches turns to gold. And then the day came when Potiphar returned home, only to be shown a coat and to hear a story. Because his wife was blasting Joseph with all sorts of wild accusations about how he had been making a pass at her and even tried to rape her. And in Genesis 19 and verse 9, or Genesis 39 and verse 19, it says, "And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, After this manner did thy servant to me, that his wrath was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in prison." Joseph was now forced to grow up quickly. And again, he's being introduced to what the older people already know, because things can always get worse. And they continued in that direction, not for a couple of months, but for another 12 years. So let me ask you this. Was Joseph a better man before or after he went to prison? He was a good man before he went, but he was a spiritual giant at the end of those 12 years. Well, why was that? The reason was simply because when given the choice to give up on God or to keep fighting, he chose to fight.
Right.
12 years is a long time to be stuck in a painful situation. And there's a lot of people who find themselves in circumstances that they have judged to be grossly unfair. The problem, however, is that most of them will choose to do what Elijah did. And that was to quit. And folks, that's the easy choice. Anybody can quit. But if you want to have your life end up like Joseph's ended, then you need to be willing to stay put like Joseph stayed put. Turn, if you would, to 2 Corinthians chapter number 8. A second battle tonight that many of you are going to run into and encounter and experience if you haven't already. You need to fight and not run when facing financial ruin or difficulties. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse number 1, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded under the riches of their liberality. In his letter to the Corinthian church, Paul is here heard describing the plight of these churches in Macedonia. He's bragging on them. Because these godly individuals, they belonged to great churches, but for some reason they were experiencing deep poverty. While we're not giving any specifics as to what had happened, we can assume, I think, that a lot of their problems was simply due to the persecution that was hurting so many of the Christians. So much so that the early church in Jerusalem was almost destroyed. So many people, thousands of people, had to flee that church, many of them ending up in Antioch. And some of these early Christians were fired from their jobs simply because they were Christians. Others found their businesses being stolen simply because the authorities could do so. But what Paul is pointing to is the fact that even though these people had lost everything and were in debt up to their eyeballs, they were still in church. So what would happen to you spiritually if you got fired from your job? Would you be too embarrassed to come to church because of what you think others might think? Would it bother you to lose your house to foreclosure to the point where you would quit church? Or if you came to the place where you had nothing, would you quit tithing on what little you might get because you're now mad at God? All of us like money. Nobody wants to do without. But there is a huge difference between things being tight and losing your life savings and you have no income. If God allowed the financial rug to be pulled out from under you, would you still be coming to church? Would you still be trying to do right? Or instead, would you be blaming God for your misfortunes and become bitter? Because as you would look around, you would see lesser Christians who have it better than you do. Years ago, when I was an assistant pastor, there was an older couple who had joined our church. They were from Latin America. They were very quiet. but they had the sweetest spirits. They were super polite. They were as faithful as could be. They were always encouraging to me and others around them, and they were basically great church members. It was only years later that I learned that they had lived in Nicaragua, and he had been the president of a bank. He made good money. The communists took over the country. They were forced to flee with nothing but the clothes that they wore. They arrived in this country with nothing. They left behind their nice home, their cars, their worldly possessions, and they were then living in a very modest home in their newly adopted country. And even though they had lost everything financially, you would never have guessed it. They were so excited about what God was doing in their lives. They were so excited to be saved and part of a great church. I'm afraid tonight, because there is a widespread kind of Christianity that is very shallow and flimsy. And the reason that it is so iffy is because it is so dependent upon circumstances. It produces what used to be called fair weather Christians. And as long as the sun is shining and the wind is calm and there's money in the bank, food in the fridge, it's easy to smile and enjoy life. But boy, when the skies turn dark and the wind picks up to the point where the trees are being uprooted, then that's the time that they decide to do something else other than trusting God. One of my favorite stories about Abraham Lincoln has to do with one of his many failed businesses, and there were plenty of them. He and a friend decided to create a partnership. They started a dry goods store. To get it off the ground, they borrowed a pretty significant amount of money. Over a period of time, the business not only went broke, but Lincoln's partner died. He then spent the next 16 years paying off a loan for what he had borrowed, in addition to what his partner had borrowed. Anybody tonight can have financial problems, but not everybody will choose to fight the temptation to run away from them when those problems come. A number of years ago, I was asked by a married couple in our church if I would go with them to a bankruptcy lawyer. They had already been to this guy. He had sold them on this idea that the greatest thing, the smartest thing in the world that they ought to do was to declare bankruptcy. So they came to me, started getting my advice. And for some reason, my advice was not lining up exactly with what the bankruptcy lawyer's advice was. So their lawyer said, why don't you bring your pastor and let me talk to him? And we'll just sit down, the three of us, and we'll just have a talk, and I'll share some things with your pastor, and that way he'll be able to better give you counsel. So I agreed. They asked me to go, and so I agreed, and I went with them. We all sat around his desk, and then he started giving me the spiel. And the spiel was, it's not their fault. This is a good couple. Hardworking. They're wanting to have a good life. But those banks are charging interest rates that are exorbitant. Those credit card companies are oppressive, almost criminal in what they charge. And this dear couple, they just need some help. They just need some relief. And not only that, it is their right as Americans to file for bankruptcy. I almost started singing the Star Spangled Banner. I was ready for a piece of Mom's apple pie. I was really feeling patriotic. After listening to his speech that blamed everybody but the couple in debt, I then asked him a question. I asked him, are you willing to allow them to charge your fees on their credit card? And he said, absolutely not. Of course not. Well, how do you intend for them to pay? Cash. They have to pay cash. While he was trying to help them get out of debt and cut loose what they owed to other people, he was first making sure that he got paid in cash before he cut everybody else loose. Somehow that doesn't seem to be the direction of Abraham Lincoln. Financial problems? Let me help you in 30 seconds. You don't even have to set up an appointment. Number one, quit spending. I don't know how many times I've heard the sob story. Our electricity's about to get cut off. We need some help. And then you see a pizza delivery car pulling up to their house. Somehow they got the money to buy a pizza, but they don't have the money to pay a bill that they owe. So, number one, quit spending. Number two, get a second job if you have to. And number three, tackle the problems instead of running from them. Amen. That's how you deal with financial issues. That's right. Turn to John chapter 9, verse number 1. A third problem that you're probably going to have to deal with. You need to fight and not run when facing the loss of your health. John chapter 9, verse 1, and as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Then Jesus answered, neither have this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made in him. We have a growing epidemic in this country, and it is caused by prosperity. There are two ways of approaching good health, two common ways. One is with good insurance, and the other is with little or no insurance. Because that's basically where the extremes are. The person with good insurance will typically not take good care of themselves physically. And then when they get sick, that's when they'll go to the hospital or a doctor and take whatever medicine they're prescribed. And then they count themselves fortunate because they have good insurance. The other person does not have good insurance. And because of that, they have decided to start eating better and exercising more and staying healthy instead of taking pills to help. My point is that by having good insurance, people are making bad health choices on a daily basis because it's as if their cheap medicine is their safety net. The number one cause of death in this country is not heart disease. The number one cause of death in this country is not cancer. The number one cause of death in the United States is due to doctors who prescribe wrong medications for their patients. The problem is not a lack of medicine. The problem is the wrong medicine. The problem is not a lack of money to buy prescription drugs, but the ability to afford the wrong medicines that are being prescribed. If you live long enough, you're going to have to deal with health issues. And when they arrive, it really won't matter if it was the doctor's fault, or if it was the insurance company's fault, or whether it was your fault, or nobody's fault. The only question at that point in time is, what will you do when it comes? Will your sickness be used to the glory of God? Or will it bring out the worst in you? Will it be a tool that God uses to strengthen you and draw you closer to Him? Or will it be your excuse to drop out of church? Your health is a battle that needs to be fought, because the devil's going to use it to try to pull people out of church and then keep those people out. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. And some of you might need this point right now. You need to fight and not run when offended. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? And who is offended and I burn not? Paul is here saying that he was just as human as anybody else. He got offended just like other people get offended. He got his feelings hurt just like other people got their feelings hurt. This morning, Brother Sigstad mentioned the missionary who was at the church where he was at the end of the meeting. The pastor shaking all of their hands and telling them, God bless you. And one missionary really didn't care for that kind of love offering. Pastor didn't even dare to take care of the missionaries that had come to his church. Another missionary that I have known for years told me of a church where he went to. It's a church about 3 hours from here. It's a church with a well-known pastor. It's a church that has a reputation. It's a church they're large enough to have their own Bible college. And it's a church that loves to bring in missionaries like crazy every year at missions conference time. And there are so many missionaries, they set up display tables. They just have missionaries all over the place. They will have minimum 12 to 15 missionaries, sometimes more. And the missionary that I know pretty well went to that church, one of many missionaries, and at the end of it, after driving his car, burning his gas, to go to this meeting that hopefully would grant him monthly support, he left with nothing. But the church seems to have plenty of money. Why would they not have enough money to at least be good to the missionaries that are coming in?
Right.
There are some pastors, and again, the church members don't know these things, but there are some pastors who will use missionaries as window dressing. The assumption of the church members, oh yeah, our church, we treat missionaries so good. I don't know, maybe you should talk to the missionaries.
Right.
Find out how good they're treated. When we have our missions conference, I don't have hardly any missionaries in, because if I cannot bring that missionary on for support, or we're kind of close, I don't even want to bring him in. If I'm not able to take care of them financially, I'm not going to have a missionary waste their time to come here when we're not going to support them, and I'm not even going to give them any gas. Please talk to missionaries who come to this church, and you'll find out that anytime they come, one of the first things that we do before they leave town is we take them to the gas station and we fill up their car.
Amen.
We've been doing that since I came to Kokomo. We treat, even if they're not our missionaries, we treat missionaries who are here with respect. Because they are men of God, trying to accomplish something for God.
Amen.
We're not talking about these missionaries brought into this church not getting monthly support. What I'm saying is they didn't even get gas money to be able to go back home. That is a recipe for a good person to get offended. Because folks, the devil's going to make sure that even good people are pushed to the place where it is so easy to get bitter and upset. Good people trying to do the right thing. You know what sometimes happens to good people? Other people take advantage of them.
Yeah, that's right. Preach.
And I'm not talking about missionaries, I'm talking about church members. Sometimes the people that are pushed the most and brought to the place where they are so tempted to get offended, they're some of the best people that you'll ever find, and they're the ones that are so helpful. And what happens is there are some people who will take advantage of those good people.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not right. As I have opportunity, as I have the chance to throw in my 2 cents worth, I will warn them about getting caught or trapped in a situation where they're taken advantage of. I don't like it. It's not right. And the reason is, I don't like seeing good people who are taken advantage of then get hurt spiritually because they get offended. Listen to this verse, and I want you to listen to it in light of other church members. Proverbs 18:19. A brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city. And their contentions are like the bars of a castle. I think that can obviously be applied to a literal brother, but it can also be applied to a Christian brother. And what that verse is saying is, you have no idea when a good person is taken advantage of, and that good person becomes offended. It's almost impossible to get them back. Nobody likes to get taken advantage of. But when a person is the kind of person that just bends over backwards over and over and over and over again, when they break, most of the time, they'll stay broken. Revelation chapter 3, if you'll turn there with me. Last thing tonight is this: you need to fight and not run when standing alone. Revelation chapter 3, verse 1, and unto the angel of the church in Sardis write, these things saith he that hath the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know thy works, that thou hast a name, that thou livest, and art dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, for I have not found thy works perfect before God. Remember therefore how thou hast received and heard, and hold fast and repent. If therefore thou shalt not watch, I will come on thee as a thief, and thou shalt not know what hour I will come upon thee. Thou hast a few names, even in Sardis, which have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. The church of Sardis had not always been this way. Once upon a time, that church in Sardis was a young and exciting church. It probably had well-known preachers and pastors that were rock solid and faithful. It must have had a tremendous group of church members who over the years helped to build that into a great church which is why it's mentioned here by name. But over a period of time, something had happened to this church. And it's not a matter of showing its age, because the church will not grow old and die. Its problem was that it had changed a lot. Now, it still had a reputation, and when people heard the name of this church, they always had a lot of good things to say about it because of its past. But the reputation was no longer deserved. This church was now very close to dying. If something drastic did not happen quickly, this church was gone. Because churches are composed of people. Churches change as the people change. A church does not just drift and take the people with it. A church drifts because of the people in that church. A church is not an idea. A church is not a facility. A church is the people.
Right.
And if you walk into a church and feel like, wow, this is a worldly church, what made it worldly? Worldly people.
Right.
If people change for the worse, that church will also change for the worse in a matter of time. If the people die spiritually, even though they are still faithful to come to church, that church will begin to die as well. In the 1940s, J. Frank Norris was pastoring two of the world's largest churches at the same time. He would take a train from Texas to Michigan, back and forth, back and forth. He would preach here on a Sunday, travel by train, preach the next church the next Sunday. Back and forth, two of the largest churches in the world, and he did it for a number of years. One church was in Fort Worth. The other church was in Detroit. The last that I heard, the church in Detroit was running around 50. And the church in Texas that he had taken out of the Southern Baptist Convention had voted to go back into the convention. When Dr. Lee Robertson pastored the Highland Park Baptist Church in Chattanooga, they had a college that generated hundreds of dedicated missionaries that did a great work for God on the mission field. The last that I heard, the church sold its facilities, changed its name, and is no longer a Baptist church. Over the past 10 years, I've seen too many once good churches change for the worse almost overnight. One went bankrupt due to mismanagement. Another practically went out of business when the pastor got a divorce, but he decided to keep on pastoring. Another church changed their name from Baptist to being the newly formed Contemporary Church. And another got caught up in the church growth movement, and they deliberately ran off the older members because they were opposed to these changes. And they wanted to rotate and get rid of the older members so that they could bring in the contemporary crowd. Another simply closed their doors because of a lack of interest. And that is where this church at Sardis found itself, because it was so close to dying. And yet even in this church there was a word of commendation. And the reason was, and listen to this, there were still a few good people in this church who were willing to fight.
Amen.
They loved their church. They had invested their lives in this church. And they were going to fight to the death to keep their church from dying. And as long as you have a church with at least a few fighters, that church is still alive.